Several times while I've been working on this set, I've gotten a little shock when I've come in contact with the outer coating on this CRT. And I didn't think much of it. I thought, oh, it's just some static charge building up. The weather's getting cooler and air drier. But it's been happening more and more, like as I was adjusting some of these slugs down here, my knuckle kept brushing up against it and I kept getting a shock. So I thought I'd investigate further, and I discovered that it's not grounded. See down there? There's a metal tab sticking out. There's one on the other side as well. And between those two, there's supposed to be a metal hoop like this I pulled out of another set. So that hooks through those two loops on the chassis and then brushes up tightly against this to ground it. And the whole thing forms a giant filter cap for the high voltage. So I definitely got to pull this out and get a ground down in there. Now fortunately on this particular model there's a ceramic high voltage filter cap inside of here. Other sets, they rely entirely on the picture tube to do the filtering. Without this being grounded, it's really not going to work right. One last shock, hopefully. Something else I noticed is that the rubber mounts are completely rock hard. And the CRT is actually even a little bit loose. There should be a rubber pad up here, which is also rock hard, and kind of a big donut O-ring on this side and on this side. And then this cloth strap holds the whole thing down tightly. So right now I can actually rock it a little bit, so that's not a good thing. So I'm going to pull this whole thing out. And as for the padding, I might actually use some plumbing washers. Otherwise, I've got some neoprene rubber strips I can cut up as needed to make padding. I tried doing a little bit of a lining on the tuner and it wasn't quite responding like I was expecting. I also was getting a little bit of fuzziness to the picture. It just wasn't as crisp as the other Admirals I've restored, so I thought I'd take a closer look at the tuner. This is not for the faint of heart. These are fairly easy to mess up and not so easy to fix. So I don't recommend you do this unless you know what you're doing, or it's a last resort, or it's a really messed up set and you're curious to see how they work. They do come out easily though. Just 4 screws hold it in. 1, 2, 3, 4. You get those from the top of the chassis. And there's only 4 wires. These 3, which just connect down to a strip right below the video IF. And then this one little piece of bare wire, that is the actual output of the tuner. So these wires are filament and power, and this twin lead, that's the actual RF, and this is the output. And that goes directly to a pin on the first IF tube. This tuner itself, so the twin lead comes right into this guy, which is a 6AG5 RF amp, and this is a 6J6. It does double duty as the oscillator and the mixer. It's a dual triode tube. And here are the various tuning slugs. This is the one I tweaked already when I was aligning the video IF. This one is a variable capacitor that's in parallel with this, which is the fine tuning. The variable fine-tuning capacitor is actually just a piece of Bakelite cut out in a spiral that goes in between this, which is just grounded, and a plate on the other side. So this forms a variable capacitor action. You tweak this to center the fine-tuning. The other tuning slugs, these are actually all variable capacitors, very low capacitance, 1, 2, 3. That's what you use for aligning the tuner. Aligning the tuner is a bit different than the video IF stages. You do not feed in an RF signal, fixed frequency, and use a VTVM. Instead, you hook up your sweep generator to the antenna terminals, and you hook up your scope to this little test point here that they conveniently provide, and you just do it visually to try to get a pattern that looks like that. Well, I just wasn't able to. Just wasn't working right. And like I said, there seemed to be some kind of noise. I just wasn't getting a good crisp picture. So what I wanted to do was chuck the parts in here. There are resistors in here that can drift out of tolerance, and it's tough to test them when it's in the set. The capacitors are all ceramic, I believe, and I don't bother messing with those. Way too high a chance of messing stuff up. Also, there are some very small coils in here. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 resistors that I can see right up here. Oh, 5, and I think there are some more that are obscured by this drum. So I want to get this drum out of here. It's held on by a spring on either side that puts a lot of pressure against the shaft here. So what you do is, I love it when the batteries run out mid-sentence. I think I left off with, to get this off you have to pop off this piece of spring wire and this one too. And in order to get this one, you have to take this screw out and get this plate off. I also just noticed that this is stamped August 31st, 1949. I really would have expected that to say 1948, since this is such an early version of the 20X1. But I gotta believe it's the original tuner because I found no evidence this had ever been replaced. I find even stranger is that I just so happen to have a spare tuner for this set. So in case I can't get this tuner working, I could give this one a try. And this one is marked November 5th, 1949. So not a whole lot of time span between these two, but they are different. Maybe they were built at different plants, I don't know, but they are the same model number, but they're noticeably different. Even the plug-in coils are somewhat different. The ones in this other, from this other set, they have a kind of a raised ridge around those buttons. But first off, I'll try giving this one an overhaul. So let's see, first up, I want to take this off. Took a bunch of photos, and of course I'll have this video as a reference. So there's the other capacitor plate there. Get this out. Just a little gentle persuasion here. Alright, that's one. And that's two. Oh, come on, it's just hung up on. There. So here's all the plug-in coils for all the channels. So most of the parts of the tuner are actually in here. There's a strip, two pop-out strips for every channel. So put that on the side. And here are those, just a handful of parts I want to check. Just tubular guys like that. That's actually a ceramic capacitor. A coil over here. And a handful of resistors. And while I'm at it, I can clean those contacts. Okay, I've got the tuner all nice and clean, including all the contacts inside. Now it's time to put it back together. So I've got this little bearing I've got to get down in there, and then the drum goes in like so. And then I have to put these spring clips back on. That's one. That's two. Alright. Now I want to get some grease on these bearing points. Lately I've been using some white lithium grease. Don't know for sure if it's the absolute best stuff to use, but it's what I've got on hand, so. So I'm going to get some down in here on this bearing wheel, and of course on the end points. Alright, and then there's the fine-tuning shaft, which goes on so. I flushed that out with some WD-40, and now I want to put some grease in there as well. I figured a lot would come off. Alright. I just need to button down this plate, and then I can reinstall the tuner, and it may look good, but it doesn't mean it works any better. The only way to find that out is to wire it back in and power the setup. Before I reinstalled the tuner, I decided I'd deal with the picture tube. So the mounts are all rock hard, and I'm missing the grounding hoop that's supposed to be in here. I got this one off already, and now I'm chipping away at this one. I don't have any tricks. I'm literally chipping away at it. For example, with a knife, just kind of get it in there, and stuff breaks away fairly easily. And then for the remaining residue, I just been using some lacquer thinner. As for that grounding hoop, I think I've got a spare one of these somewhere. To give you some idea of how they work, kind of hooks down under there, and then underneath. This one might not be the right size, but yeah, something like that. And then this part brushes up against the conductive coating on the outside of the picture tube. That picture tube was in there really good. It was sealed up tight against this, and it sure looks like it's the original, so I can't imagine where the original one went. And maybe they forgot to put it on in the factory, because these things don't exactly fall out. They hook in there pretty good, and with the weight of the CRT on it, there's no way that's going to fall out. You know, very, very curious. Alright, once I get these out, I notice that there's some rust around here, so I'll use some naval jelly on that. And then I'll cut up some new mounts. Probably go with this. Might be a little too thick, we'll see. Just cut out a section of it, and then use some of this GC rubber to metal cement. And I have to remember, before I put the picture tube back in, I got to reinstall the tuner, because a couple of these screws get blocked by the picture tube. So you got to do the stuff in the right order, or you just have to take it right back out again. Okay, I got all the old gunk cleaned up out of here, and I cut 2 new pieces of rubber out. Now I'm going to glue them down. You're supposed to apply the rubber to metal adhesive to both surfaces and let it set up for a little bit, and then press them together with some pressure. I want to refresh my memory to see for how long. Let dry until tacky, then press together. Allow several hours or overnight to set. So that is what I will do. Okay, the new rubber mounts have set up so I can reinstall the tuner. First I feed the twin lead through the hole in the top of the chassis, and feed the shaft through the front of the chassis, and move it up into position. And there are 4 screws that hold it in place through the top of the chassis. Alright, turns real nice. I was flipping through this book, Television Receiver Servicing, by Milton Kiver. It's a really, really good book if you want to get into vintage TV restoring. And I just so happened to have found a section on tuners, and they show this specific tuner. Oh, there it is. Channel strips and all. Made by the Standard Coil Company, apparently. It's a kind of a generic schematic. Mine is roughly the same, some minor differences. Show a bit how it's put together. Something else I found interesting is they talk about this RF amp tube. Every one I've come across had a 6AG5, but apparently a 6CB6 and 6BC5 are more or less plug-in compatible, but the 6CB6 and 6BC5 have higher gain. So, not really so much important now, because generally you're going to be feeding this in with like a VCR or an RF modulator. But interesting to note that if for whatever reason you needed more gain, you could pop in tubes that were a little bit newer. It says you probably will need to do an alignment on the tuner, but it's certainly an easy way to boost the gain. Alright, we have a little bit of wiring to hook back up, and reinstall the CRT, and let's see how this works.
What's that supposed to be?
Alright, I fired the set back up and hooked up a digital TV converter to the antenna terminals. I've got it set for channel 4 right now, and as you can see the reception's horrible. And now I'm going to try tweaking the channel slug. Alright. As is so often the case with these split carrier sounds, I get better sound when the picture's a little bit fuzzy. And when I get the sharpest picture, the sound's off a little bit. Go for kind of a compromise. Alright, it's not too bad. Let's try channel 3 now. Oop, it's also off. Huh, that's interesting. Picture seems noticeably sharper on channel 3 than on channel 4. So here's channel 3. And here's channel 4. There's like a little bit of overall kind of fuzzy and haziness to it. Static, I guess you'd say. Not a whole lot I can do about that. The channel slugs are kind of sealed other than that little slug you can tune at one end, and I just kind of already tweaked this the best picture. Not that it really matters, I'll just use channel 3. Just kind of curious. It's as good as I can get it. Not a huge difference, but channel 3 is a little bit clearer. At any rate, picture seems noticeably better to me, so I'm glad I went through and cleaned up the tuner. Now for a final step, I will go ahead and get a sweep generator on there and go through the RF mixer alignment steps. Just to see if I can get it a little bit sharper than this. The setup for aligning the tuner is pretty simple. The sweep generator goes directly to the antenna terminals. The scope hooks up via a 10K resistor to this convenient test point. And they suggest hooking up a 1.5 volt DC source on the AGC bus that allows you to put higher level signals into the antenna terminals without overloading the tuner. So that connects between ground, that's the red wire, and the black wire, which is the AGC. I just solder this directly to a 1.5 volt cell. Otherwise you could use a DC power supply. And finally they suggest turning the contrast all the way up. So here's what I've got. Aligning this is a little bit different than doing the video IF stages. You don't use a fixed frequency and use a VTVM. This is entirely visual. The adjustments you make are this W here. A8, A9, A10. It's these 3 trimmer capacitors on top of the tuner. It's those little screw looking things. There's one right here. and another here, and finally one over here. This guy is actually a coarse tuning for the fine tuning control. It's a variable capacitor in parallel with this variable capacitor. Now the idea is to see, is this the right page? Oop. Okay. The idea is that the curve should look like this. And in particular, the two peaks should be the sound and the video carrier, which is different for every channel. And they give those frequencies here. So, for example, I have it set for channel 3 right now, and I should have a peak at 61.25 and 65.75. The adjustments for that are those three controls. So basically you hook this up, set your markers here, and twiddle those controls until you get to look more or less like this. Then flip through some of the other channels and see that they all look more or less like this. And there's also the individual channel tuning slug on the front here. So mine doesn't look off like it's off too bad. Obviously this hump's a little bit lower than that one, and I gotta double check the frequencies. For that, I will use my frequency counter. I know that on the highest frequency range on this RF generator, the 32 to 150, this is off a little bit. I can tell that, for example, because if I dial this in on 60, that's a bad example because it's hard to see on this. Increase the sweep width here. So that right there should be 50 megahertz. I dial this in on 50 exactly. They don't coincide. The smaller pip on the right is my RF generator, and this is the sleep generator. I trust the sleep generator more than this. So I will hook this up to, actually I'll do that right now and show you that it's off. Right. 52.2 or 3. So I'm going to have to use my frequency counter to, let's see, 61.25. It'd be nice to have one of those fancy RF generators where you can just digitally dial in the frequency for instances like this, but I'd say that's close enough to 61.25. Okay, here's that 61.25 megahertz marker, and as we can see, it's off a little bit. So I need to alter this response curve so it has a peak response at 61.25. I'll do that by manipulating those three tuning capacitors. And as I said, this is just visual. We just kind of tweak each trimmer cap and see what effect it has. Okay, this one definitely has a pretty dramatic effect on the response. So now I have equal peaks, but I shifted the response even further over to the higher frequency, so that's not what I want. If I go this way, now I've got that peak right at 61.25, but I've killed the other side. So let me try one of the other trimmers and see if we can get that other side to come back up. There we go. Alright, so if this other peak is at 65.75, so we're pretty much in business. So let's get this at 65.75. I got my RF generator back in the frequency counter. Alright, that's 65.75. Alright, look at that. Dead on. Alright. If you get a chance to fool around with a sweep generator on a TV, you can really get a feel for how they work. For example, if I change the center frequency of the RF generator, we just get a static. And when I bring it into range, it's actually sort of receiving the sweep generator. And if I move the marker generator around, it actually has an effect on the screen. And if I turn on the internal modulation of 1 kilohertz on my RF generator, you get an actual pattern on there. Now it's not going to be audible because this is AM modulation and sound on a TV is FM modulation, whereas the video is AM modulation. So putting some modulation on the marker generator actually affects the video and puts some stripes on it. Alright, so now that I got that all pretty well tweaked up, I can move on to the sound. And by the way, this is why you want to use as low level signal as possible. I've got my marker generator cranked up now with the modulation. As you can see, it makes the pattern all crazy. You really want to keep these signal levels low to get a nice clean response curve.